On the morning of May 15th, 1963, in Christian County, Kentucky, every corn farmer in the county walked out to his field at sunrise and found his crop lying flat and black-tipped from the hardest killing frost anyone could remember. In the second week of May, the temperature had dropped to 28 degrees overnight. Not a light frost, not a surface chill. 28 degrees for 4 hours, from 2 in the morning until shortly after 6, when the sun came up and found the damage already done. The corn that had been pushing up through the warm Kentucky soil for 2 weeks, 6 and 8 inches tall, tender and green, and full of the specific promise of a good planting year, was gone. The cells in the young leaves had frozen and ruptured, and the plants were standing dead, or lying flat, or curled in on themselves in the way frost-killed corn curls when the water inside it expands and bursts the walls that held it together. In Christian County in 1963, you planted corn when the soil hit 50 degrees. That was what the County Extension Service said. That was what the University of Kentucky research said. That was what the field days and the demonstration plots and the agronomists who had spent their careers measuring plant emergence and soil temperature had determined was the optimal planting window. Soil temperature 50 degrees. Plant your corn. The calendar said mid-April in Christian County. Most of the county had planted in the third week of April. Most of the county's corn was dead by sunrise on May 15th. There was one field that was not dead. Luther Caudill's bottom field, 40 acres of flat creek. Bottom ground that grew the best corn in his operation showed rows of bright green seedlings at sunrise on May 15th that were 2 inches tall and completely untouched by the frost. Not lying flat, not black-tipped, standing straight and green in the morning light with the frost still white on the ground around them, too small and too close to the soil to have been caught in the coldest layer of air above the field. Luther had planted that corn on May 1st, 2 weeks after his neighbors, 2 weeks after the soil temperature said he should have planted, 2 weeks after Randall Pitts had driven past his field and noted in his extension records that the Caudle bottom ground was still unplanted when every other operation in his district was already in the ground. Luther had planted on May 1st because the Old Farmer's Almanac said to plant corn in Christian County, Kentucky on May 1st. And the Old Farmer's Almanac said that because May 1st fell in the second quarter of the lunar cycle, the waxing gibbous moon, which the Almanac identified as the optimal planting window for above-ground crops in the Kentucky growing region. Luther had planted by the Almanac his entire farming life. His father had planted by the Almanac. His grandfather Harlan had planted by the Almanac. And it was Harlan who had made Luther understand, when Luther was 9 years old and sitting beside his grandfather on the farmhouse porch after supper, that the Almanac was not superstition, and it was not religion, and it was not luck. It was the specific accumulated observation of people who had watched what happened when you planted at different times across a longer span of years than any individual farmer's memory could hold. It was pattern recognition across centuries. You could argue with it. Plenty of people did. But the pattern had been right more times than it had been wrong, and Harlan Caudle had lived long enough to know the difference. Luther had never stopped planting by it, not when the Extension Service told him the soil temperature research superseded it, not when his neighbors laughed at him at the feed store for waiting 2 weeks after they were already in the field. Not when Randall Pitts drove out to the farm in 1959 to explain, gently and with complete sincerity, that the University of Kentucky trials showed no yield advantage to lunar planting and a demonstrable advantage to soil temperature planting. He listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, without arguing. Then he went home and planted when the Almanac said to plant. May 15th, 1963 was the morning the Almanac was vindicated in Christian County. Let me tell you about Luther Caudle, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he was following. Luther was 62 years old in the spring of 1963. He had farmed the same 140 acres in Christian County his entire adult life, taking over from his father in 1935 when his father's health failed and the family needed someone who could manage the full operation. The farm ran tobacco on the upper slopes and corn in the bottom ground, the way Christian County farms had run for 100 years, because the ground that grew the best tobacco and the ground that grew the best corn were different ground, and you used each for what it was suited to. Luther was not a man who did things without understanding them. He was not following the Almanac the way a man follows a lucky charm or a superstition he cannot explain. He had asked his grandfather Harlan to explain it when he was old enough to ask, and Harlan had explained it in the kitchen on a winter evening with the Almanac open on the table between them. The moon's gravitational pull affects water, Harlan had said. You understand that from the tides. Luther had said he understood that. The soil has water in it, Harlan had said. The moisture in the soil responds to the same pull. When the moon is pulling the water up through the soil profile, the seed that sits in that soil has more moisture available to it. More moisture means faster germination. Faster germination means the plant is further along when the weather turns. Luther had thought about this. He had asked, why does it matter how far along the plant is? Harlan had looked at him. Because a plant that is further along in its development is more resistant to things that kill younger plants. Cold, dry spells, late frost. He paused. The Almanac does not tell you the weather. It tells you to plant when the plant will have the best chance of being strong enough to survive what the weather does. Luther had thought about that for a long time. It was not magic. It was not religion. It was a theory about plant development and moisture and resistance that made biological sense if you thought about it long enough. Whether the moon's gravitational pull was really moving water through Kentucky's soil, the way Harlan described it, was something Luther had no way to test. What he could test was the outcome. He had been testing it his whole farming life, and the Almanac's planting dates had produced good corn more years than the alternative. Now let me tell you about Randall Pitts, because you need to understand what he was offering before you can understand why Luther declined it. Randall had taken the Christian County Extension position in 1958, fresh from a graduate program at the University of Kentucky, where he had studied soil science and crop production systems. He was 36 years old and thoroughly trained in the scientific method as applied to agriculture, which meant he believed in controlled trials, replicated plots, statistical significance, and the specific kind of knowledge that could be measured and quantified and published. The Old Farmer's Almanac was none of those things. It was a publication that had been printed continuously since 1792 that claimed to predict weather based on a proprietary formula involving solar activity and astronomical data. and that made planting date recommendations based on lunar phase and sign that had never been validated in controlled agricultural research to Randall's knowledge. The University of Kentucky had not conducted trials on lunar planting. The USDA had not conducted trials on lunar planting. The peer-reviewed literature on lunar planting effects on crop germination and yield was thin and inconsistent. What the peer-reviewed literature did contain, extensively and clearly, was research on soil temperature and corn germination. Corn seed germinates optimally at soil temperatures between 50 and 60 degrees. Below 50 degrees, germination is slow and uneven, and the plant is exposed to soil pathogens longer before it emerges. Above 60, germination is fast and the plant establishes quickly. Planting date recommendations based on soil temperature at 4-inch depth were scientifically sound, well replicated, and consistently validated across multiple growing seasons and geographies. Randall had driven out to Luther's farm in the spring of 1959 to share all of this because Luther was the only farmer in his district still publicly maintaining that lunar planting dates produced better results than soil temperature dates, and Randall felt an obligation to help him understand the available science. Luther had poured him coffee. He had listened to the soil temperature research. He had asked questions that surprised Randall with their specificity. Luther had clearly read more about plant physiology than most farmers Randall dealt with. He had asked about the research methodology. He had asked whether any of the UK trials had been conducted in late frost years. Randall had checked his clipboard. The answer was no. Luther had nodded. He had thanked Randall for coming. He had poured him more coffee. "Do you know why I plant by the Almanac?" Luther asked. "Because your grandfather did," Randall said. "He said it without condescension. He meant it as a straightforward observation." Luther looked at him. "That is part of it," he said. "But my grandfather explained his reasoning, and the reasoning made sense to me." He paused. "The Almanac dates push my planting 2 weeks later than the soil temperature dates. In a year with a late frost, that 2 weeks is the difference between a crop and a replant." He looked at Randall. "How many late frost years does Christian County have in a generation?" Randall thought about it. "Maybe 3 or 4 significant late frost events in any 20-year period," he said. "Frost after May 10th. Luther nodded. "And in a normal year, how much yield do I lose by planting 2 weeks later than optimal?" Randall looked at his clipboard. The university data showed a yield reduction of about 4 to 7% for corn planted in the first week of May versus the third week of April in Christian County. "Call it 5% on average." 5%, Luther said. "And in a late frost year, a man who planted in April loses how much?" Randall was quiet. A late frost year after full emergence meant replanting. Replanting meant losing the entire planting window advantage, plus the cost of the second seed purchase, plus the late season yield reduction from the delayed final planting date. In a severe frost year, an early planter could lose 30, 40, 50% of his potential yield compared to a man who had not yet planted. "You are not just comparing good years," Luther said. "You are comparing all years." He looked at Randall. "In most years, I lose 5% by planting late. In a frost year, I gain everything." He picked up his almanac. The almanac has been tracking these patterns for 160 years. He looked at Randall. "Has the University of Kentucky been tracking them that long?" Randall drove back to Hopkinsville. He made a note in his records. "Caudle, Luther, maintains lunar planting schedule, understands the risk trade-off argument, unlikely to change without compelling evidence. He had used the word compelling. He had not defined what it would take to produce compelling evidence. He did not need to define it. The spring of 1963 would define it for him. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone absorb information they disagreed with, not because they could not understand it, but because they were measuring it against a longer set of data than the person sharing it had access to? Have you ever watched a man listen patiently to an argument and give it full consideration and then do exactly what he was going to do anyway, not from stubbornness, but from a specific kind of knowledge that operates over a longer time frame than any single trial can capture? Luther Caudle had been doing that for 40 years. Every spring when his neighbors planted in April, and every spring when he planted in May, and every spring when the extension agent noted in his records that the Caudle bottom ground was 2 weeks behind the county average. He had been doing it without drama, without argument, without trying to convince anyone else that his method was right. He just planted when the Almanac said to plant, and he kept records of what happened, and the record across 40 years said the Almanac was right more often than it was wrong, and that the years when it was right, it was very right. May 15th, 1963 was one of those years. Now let me tell you about what happened that morning and the days that followed. Randall Pitts was in his truck at 6:30 in the morning on May 15th, driving county roads. He had been driving county roads since 6 because a farmer had called him at 5:45 to report frost damage. By 6, he had confirmed that the damage was real and widespread. By 6:30, he was in his third field of the morning, walking rows of dead corn, recording the damage for the extension report he was going to have to write. He pulled onto the Caudle farm road at 7:15, not to assess damage. He drove there because Luther's field was on his route and he wanted to see it, and because some part of him, not yet acknowledged, suspected what he was going to find. He found it. Luther was already in the field. He was walking his rows the way he walked them every morning in planting season, not fast, not slow, crouching occasionally to look at the soil surface, straightening up, moving on. The bright green 2-inch corn seedlings were visible all around him, untouched, standing in the clear May morning with frost still white on the ground between the rows. Randall parked at the field edge and got out of his truck. He stood at the fence line and looked at the field for a long time before Luther noticed him. When Luther came to the fence, Randall did not say anything immediately. He looked at the corn. He looked at Luther. He looked at the corn again. "How much did you lose?" Randall asked. "Nothing," Luther said. Randall nodded. He had known the answer before he asked. He looked down the county road at the neighboring fields, the flat, black-tipped corn visible even from this distance. He looked back at Luther's 2-inch seedlings standing green and healthy. The Almanac said, May 1st, Randall said. May 1st through the 3rd. Luther said, second quarter moon. He pulled the almanac from his back pocket and showed Randall the page. The planting dates for Christian County, Kentucky, were marked in pencil the way Harlan had marked them, and the way Luther's father had marked them, and the way Luther had marked them every year since he took over the farm. Randall looked at the page. He looked at Luther. He had spent 5 years driving past this farm, noting in his records that the Caudle planting was 2 weeks late, measuring the yield disadvantage in the trial data, believing with complete sincerity that Luther was leaving bushels in the field every year, he followed the Almanac instead of the soil temperature research. He was beginning to understand that yield in a good year was not the whole calculation. Luther had told him that in 1959. He had heard it and acknowledged it and not changed his recommendation because the good years were more common than the frost years, and the aggregate math still favored the early planting. What the aggregate math did not capture was what a frost year cost a family that had already planted, not just the yield loss, the cash for replanting, the delay, the late-season reduction on the replanted crop, the loan payment that still came due regardless of what the frost did, the specific financial exposure of a farm that had committed its planting budget to a crop that was now lying flat and dead in the field. Luther had no replanting cost. Luther had no delay. Luther's corn was 2 inches tall and growing. In 30 days, it would be where his neighbor's replanted corn was trying to be, and it would have 30 days of root development advantage that the replanted crop would never recover. "I owe you an apology," Randall said. He said it the way Luther said everything, directly, without extra words. Luther looked at him. "What for?" "For telling you that you were farming wrong," Randall said. "For 4 years, I had the soil temperature data, and I thought that was the whole picture." He paused. "You were looking at a longer picture." Luther put the almanac back in his pocket. "You were not wrong about the soil temperature," he said. "That research is correct." He looked at his field. "You were wrong about it being the only thing that mattered." Randall nodded. That was precisely what he had been wrong about. "What do you tell your other farmers this morning?" Luther asked. Randall thought about it. He thought about the 12 calls he was going to have to make, the 12 farm visits, the 12 conversations about replanting options and insurance, and what the cooperative had in terms of late-season seed availability. He thought about what he could have told those farmers 2 weeks ago that might have made this morning different. "I tell them about replanting," Randall said. "That is what I can do now." Luther looked at him. "And next year?" Randall considered it. He was a careful man, and he did not want to say something he could not back up with data. But he also understood, standing at a fence line on May 15, 1963, in front of 2 inches of living corn surrounded by dead corn in every other direction, that the data he had been relying on was incomplete. "Next year," Randall said, "I tell them what you told me, that the soil temperature dates are right for most years, and that in a late frost year they are very wrong." He paused. "And I tell them to look at what they can afford to lose before they decide which calendar to follow." Luther looked at the field. "That is what my grandfather told me in 1921, he said. He said, 'Decide what you can afford to lose and plant accordingly.'" He watched his corn move in the morning light. "I could afford to lose 5% in the good years. I could not afford to lose everything in the frost years." He looked at Randall. "The almanac protected me from the thing I could not afford." Randall drove back to Hopkinsville. He had 12 calls to make. He made them all that morning, and on each one he mentioned, without being asked, that Luther Caudill's corn had come through the frost because he had planted 2 weeks later than the soil temperature dates recommended, and that there were legitimate reasons a farmer might consider a more conservative planting schedule in frost-risk springs, and that the Extension Office was going to look at the frost frequency data for Christian County more carefully going forward. It was not a full endorsement of lunar planting, Randall was not prepared to go that far without the data, but it was an honest accounting of what had happened and what it meant, and that was something. If you want to know what happened the following spring in Christian County and how many farmers showed up at Luther's farm in April asking to see his almanac, subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me if anyone in your family ever planted by the moon or the almanac, and what they thought about it. The following spring, 4 farmers in Christian County shifted their corn planting dates later, not to May 1st. None of them went all the way to the almanac dates, but to late April instead of mid-April, building in a week of frost buffer that the soil temperature dates did not require. Randall drove out to Luther's farm that April to tell him. He sat at the kitchen table and told him what he had done and what the farmers had decided, and that he had not told them to plant by the almanac, but that he had told them the frost risk data supported a more conservative planting window than the pure soil temperature research suggested. Luther listened to all of it. Then he said, "That is a reasonable position." Randall looked at him. "You do not think it goes far enough?" Luther got up and poured coffee. He set the almanac on the table between them. He sat back down. "I think the almanac has 200 years of accumulated observation in it," he said. "I think that observation was done by careful people who are watching the same thing you are watching, which is what works and what does not across many different years." He looked at the almanac. "I also think that the people who wrote it did not have controlled trials and statistical significance." He paused. "Both things are true. The observation is real, even if the explanation is incomplete." Randall looked at the almanac on the table. He had spent his career dismissing it. He was not ready to recommend it, but he was beginning to understand that dismissing it was also wrong. "What would it take for you to believe the almanac is scientifically valid?" Randall asked. Luther thought about it. He looked at the almanac. 40 more years of records from my farm," he said, "and from farms like mine across the region." He paused. "That is what it took for me to believe it." He looked at Randall. "I am 63 years old, and I started the records when I was 22. He picked up the almanac. "These are my 40 years." He tapped the spine. "And behind them are my grandfather's 40 years and his father's before that." He put it back on the table. "How long are your trials?" Randall thought about it. "The UK soil temperature trials went back to the early 1940s. 20 years, give or take." Luther looked at him. 20 years is a good start," he said. He slid the almanac across the table. "Keep going." Randall drove back to Hopkinsville. He had a field day to plan and a county report to write and 12 farms to visit before the end of the month. He was a busy man with a clear professional mandate, but he had put the almanac on his passenger's seat when he got in the truck, and he had not moved it to the back seat, and it stayed there all the way back to Hopkinsville. He had never read the Old Farmer's Almanac. He spent that evening reading the planting calendar section, not to convert to it, to understand what 40 years of farmers he dismissed had been reading and why. Let me tell you about the years after, because Luther Caudill farmed for 20 more years after the spring of 1963, and every one of them he planted by the almanac. Not every year vindicated him the way 1963 did. Most years were normal years, and in normal years the almanac dates cost him the 5% yield reduction that Randall's research predicted. In the good years, his neighbor's April corn out-yielded his May corn. That was the honest accounting, and Luther never denied it. What he kept in his records was the full picture. Every year from 1935 to 1982, he recorded his planting date, his almanac date, the final yield, and the weather events during the growing season. By 1982, he had 47 years of records in 3 composition notebooks kept in the barn's stripping room. In those 47 years, Christian County experienced 5 significant late frost events in May: 1940, 1951, 1955, 1963, and 1978. In all 5 of those years, Luther's almanac-timed planting protected him from the worst damage. In 2 of them, 1963 and 1978, the protection was total. He lost nothing. His neighbors replanted. In the 42 remaining normal or early season years, Luther's yield averaged 4.8% below the county average, the exact number Randall's research had predicted. Luther had done the math himself. Across 47 years, the 5 frost years each represented a benefit of roughly 30 to 40% over a replant scenario. The 42 normal years each represented a cost of approximately 5%. When he ran the numbers, as he had on a winter evening in 1980 at the kitchen table under the lamp, the almanac timing was ahead of the soil temperature timing across the full span of years. Not dramatically ahead, but ahead. He had shown the calculation to Randall in 1981. Randall had been the extension agent in Christian County for 23 years by then. He sat with the calculation for a long time. "This is not a controlled trial," Randall said. "I know that," Luther said. "I cannot publish this as scientific evidence." "I know that too," Luther said. He closed the notebook. "I am not asking you to publish it. I am asking you to look at it." Randall looked at it. He looked at 47 years of one man's records showing one man's outcome from one decision made consistently over a lifetime. It was not science. It was not replicated. It had no control group. It had no statistical analysis. It was also 47 years of real outcomes from real crops in real Christian County, Kentucky weather, which was something. "Your grandfather started these records?" Randall asked. "My grandfather started them," Luther said. "I have continued them." Randall handed the notebooks back. He said, "I have been the extension agent in this county for 23 years. I have given planting date recommendations based on University of Kentucky research for every one of those 23 years. He looked at Luther. "I have also watched 5 late frost events damage the crops of farmers who followed my recommendations and not damage yours." He paused. "I cannot recommend the almanac to my district, but I will stop telling them it is wrong." Luther looked at him. "That is a reasonable position," he said, the same thing he had said in 1964. He poured coffee. Luther retired from active farming in 1983 at the age of 82. His son Thomas had been working alongside him since 1968, and the transition was easy. Thomas had grown up watching his father read the almanac on the porch after supper the way Harlan had read it and the way Luther's father had read it. He had grown up planting on May 1st while the neighbors planted in April, and he had been asked at the feed store why his father waited, and he had given the same answer his father gave. "Because the almanac says so." And when people laughed, he had given the same follow-up his father gave. "Ask me again after the next late frost." Thomas plants by the almanac. His son plants by the almanac. The 3 composition notebooks from Luther's 47 years of records are in the stripping room of the barn in a metal box that keeps out moisture. Beside them are the records Thomas has kept since 1983, adding to what Luther started. Randall Pitts retired from the Christian County Extension Service in 1987 after 29 years. At his retirement dinner in Hopkinsville, he gave a short speech. He talked about the farmers he had worked with, the programs he had administered, the research he had brought from the university to the field. Near the end, he said something that his colleagues found slightly puzzling. He said, "The best farmer in my district never took my advice about when to plant. He was right not to. I learned more from watching him than I taught him." Nobody at the dinner knew he was talking about Luther Caudill. Luther did not attend the dinner. He was 86 years old and not getting around well, and dinners in Hopkinsville were not something he had ever had strong feelings about attending. He heard about the speech from a neighbor who had been there. He sat with it for a while on the porch. He did not say anything about it. He went inside and got the Almanac and read the planting dates for the following season, running his finger down the column the way Harlan had run his finger down the column 60 years ago on the same porch. The dates were the same as they had always been. The moon did not change its schedule to accommodate what anyone thought about it. Luther had understood that since 1921. It was what made the Almanac trustworthy. It was indifferent to opinion. It simply recorded what it had always recorded and let the results speak across the years. He marked the planting dates in pencil and went to bed. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories about the knowledge that runs longer than any controlled trial can run. About the farmers who kept records across lifetimes and passed them to sons who kept more records. Building an understanding of the land that no university program could replicate, because no university program ran for 47 unbroken years on the same 40 acres in Christian County, Kentucky. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, did anyone in your family plant by the Almanac or the moon? Did they pass it down? I want to know what those families found. The Almanac is still in the stripping room beside the composition notebooks. The Frost of 1963 is a story Thomas's son knows by heart. It is part of how his family understands their ground, not as history, but as evidence. Evidence that had been accumulating since Harlan Caudle sat on the porch in 1921 and put a pencil mark beside a date. The moon does not ask for your opinion about its schedule. It simply moves. The farmers who learned to move with it, who understood that the calendar of the sky and the calendar of the soil were different calendars that needed to be read together. Those farmers built something that is still building. Plant when the Almanac says. Keep records. Wait for the late frost year. It will come.